We're fortunate today to have both Calli Wilsey and Kelly Crompton here to discuss what happened in Carson City earlier this year. I'd also like to thank our section directors, Garrett Terberg and Fred Steinman and the University of Nevada, Reno for making our event possible today. Before we begin, a few quick housekeeping items. If you haven't already done so, please be sure to mute your microphone as we present. For our AICP members, this session has been approved for 1 CM credit. Please be sure to add this activity to your CM log under your APA account under event number 9219997 at the conclusion of the session. The session is being recorded and will be available on the APA Nevada chapter YouTube channel. I'd also like to let everyone know to be on the lookout for registration information today for the 2021 APA ASLA Nevada chapter state conference on October 18th to 20th in downtown Reno at the Reno Ballroom. This year, our program features a partnership with ASLA Nevada, the American Society of Landscape Architects. Details and registration will also be available on our website, as well as lodging codes for the Silver Legacy across the street for anyone in need of lodging. Finally, if you have any questions today for our panelists, please be sure to type them into the chat box. We'll take as many as we have time for when we open things up for questions toward the end of the session. With that, we're ready to begin. We are privileged to have 2 local government legislative experts joining us from Northern Nevada and Southern Nevada. Calli Wilsey oversees government relations for the City of Reno, coordinating public policy efforts between all levels of government. Calli previously oversaw administrative services for the City of Reno's Community Development Department and spent 8 years in the public sector for both local government and the Washoe County School District. Welcome, Calli.
Hi, thanks, Marco. I appreciate your invitation out here, and I see a lot of faces that I worked with in my time in community development world. So hi to everybody out there.
Yeah. And Kelly Crompton is the Government Affairs Manager at the City of Las Vegas. Kelly is a graduate of UNLV with a bachelor's in political science. Prior to her work at the city, Kelly worked in government affairs for the Las Vegas Metro Chamber of Commerce and participated in campaigns for federal, state, and local candidates. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Mark. I'm glad to be here.
So the 81st legislative session was totally unlike any previous session we've had, given that everything took place under the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Kelly, what were your thoughts on this session and how it was a session unlike any other?
Well, so I've been lobbying for about 5 sessions now. I started at the Chamber of Commerce and moved over to the City of Las Vegas during what was then an unprecedented legislative session in 2015, when we saw a red wave here at the legislature, and we're under complete Republican control. This session beat that session by a long shot, in that we kind of got a taste for it in the special sessions leading up to this legislative session. Where I'll just start with those special sessions were unlike any other. They were virtual. There was not any access to legislators, to LCB staff, to documentation. We were watching bill hearings during the special sessions at midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, waiting and waiting and waiting. You wouldn't see language for bills until they dropped the minute the hearing started. So we had a little bit of a taste of what this session then would look like, in that while the legislators fixed, they weren't doing things in the dark of night. They weren't, hiding behind text messaging or cell phones. They tried to be as accessible as possible and heard some of the concerns from lobbyists and the general public on that special session. This session was not like any other. Normally in a legislative session, thousands of people come to Carson City. The economy does really well in Carson City because we're stuck in hotel rooms and we have to eat at the local, restaurants and bars. A lot of the work that we as lobbyists and legislators do happen at those local establishments. All of that was thrown out the window for the first couple of months of this legislative session. So the majority of the work we were doing was just like this. I sat at my desk most of the time, waiting for hearings, not knowing when hearings would happen. And as you probably are all aware, the legislature is not subject to open meeting law. So again, we weren't seeing agendas until 20 minutes beforehand. At the beginning of session, they were really good about posting 24 hours in advance, but it made the job of a lobbyist a lot harder because information is the key to being a good lobbyist and to having an effective legislative session. The majority of the work that we do, thanks to people like you, we are not subject matter experts. We do not work in these fields all day long. We have about this much information to be deadly. And if we get asked a question, we've got to immediately run to professionals like yourselves to make sure that we have the right information and that we're negotiating based on information that will help your jobs be a lot easier. And that's difficult when it's virtual. I can run down the hall. I know exactly where Calli is. I know she's in a hearing. I can run down the hall to Calli and say, hey, SB, whatever, 233 just had an amendment. Southern Nevada is fine, but it's going to really impact Northern Nevada. We need to figure out how we're going to negotiate this bill. In this virtual session, we couldn't do a lot of those things. We couldn't negotiate the way we normally negotiate. And so this session was difficult in that the process just took so much more time, from the negotiating of amendments to the hearing aspect. Normally in hearings, they'd start their hearing, they hear from the presenter, the proponent of that bill. They go through, a PowerPoint presentation of the language of the bill and what they're trying to change in NRS. And then they would have question and answer from the legislators. And then they would have, people in support speak, people in opposition speak, people in neutral speak. Everyone got 2 minutes. And normally in a session, you could speak for however long you wanted when you're testifying on a bill, as long as you've got relevant information to testify on. I think a lot of opponents of bills or people who, subject matter experts that were just trying to make legislation a little bit better had a tough time. And it was very frustrating that we got 2 minutes to oppose a bill, but we had 65 pages of legislation that we had to oppose. The opponents of bills were not given the same amount of time that proponents were given because they were the ones that were presenting bills. So the process just took a lot longer. Because that virtual process took a lot longer, bills weren't heard. That normally we see about, 1,200, 1,300 bills come through in a session. A lot of bills just died on that first deadline day because the process took so long, they couldn't hear all the bills that they needed to hear. And so technically it was just a lot more difficult to run effective legislation. And so the people in charge heard the bills they wanted to hear, and the rest of those bills kind of fell by the wayside.
Yeah, I was on the other end of things. Sometimes there were a few bills that I followed where that definitely happened. Going into the session, it seemed that the emphasis from legislators and Governor Sisolak was going to be on the budget and pandemic response. How did this end up changing as the session went on, Calli?
Margo, you're absolutely right. We anticipated this session to be heavily budget focused going into it. If we rewind pretty much a year from now, they were in the special sessions that Calli was referencing. And at that point, we were expecting a $1.2 billion shortfall at the state, really due to COVID revenue losses. Not sure where we were going to end up as a state, particularly with our heavy tourism driven economy here and the impact that it would have. And so the governor called that special session for them to address this revenue. So kind of after that, we really were anticipating everybody saying, we don't know how we are going to solve this. And that's really going to be what our focus is on. And so we kind of expected that. In December, the numbers got a little bit better with the economic forum coming back, that the outlook still showed a decline in revenues, but not as bad as we anticipated. So at that point, they were still saying we still have a lot of work to do with budget, trying to figure out what the governor's budget proposal would be. But through session, that changed. We had the big federal announcement around the American Rescue Plan in anticipation of large buckets of dollars coming to the state and local governments. The news about vaccines being approved and the impact that could have on the economy led to the final economic forum forecast coming out, really saying we actually have more money than we anticipated. So that really kind of changed the conversation and led to more capacity for more robust policy discussions than we anticipated going in. Now it's mixed with the process problems that Kelly was referencing, so they didn't get everything they wanted, but definitely more than I think was anticipated, because the budget ended up being more on the positive side with those kind of components we talked about.
Yeah, that certainly frames things. Throughout the session, we updated members on the status of literally thousands of bill draft requests and the bills themselves. I was wondering if both of you could share some of your insights on the bills that had maybe the most to do with city and regional planning. And we have for our viewers, we have a kind of a list that we've shared around with Kelly and Calli, but we'll throw this out. Calli, maybe if you want to talk about a couple of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the first ones that we talked about, engaged with as local governments, we actually had this conversation with the Nevada League of Cities, who's the one who put forward this bill. It was Assembly Bill 3. And we really supported and pushed for this, not only in the wake of COVID, but also just a desire to allow more proficient or efficient processes. And ultimately what the bill does is it allows for electronic submission of development maps to the county recorder if the county recorder has a process established and in place. So the bill is enabling. We knew that not every county would be in a place where the electronic submission would be possible. We knew that there would be a fiscal impact to that. So wanting just to ensure that the law allowed this process to occur when regionally or locally entities were able to go through this. So we really support and push for it. And we were happy to see this bill go through. There wasn't a whole lot of opposition. It was just more making sure that we had the right language in place that didn't conflict with other existing components of NRS more than anything. So we're excited to see that bill be a possibility for us down the road. And I'm sure folks on this call would be involved in those processes as they're established at the local level.
And I would just quickly add real quick to AB3, this is a perfect example of how professionals like yourselves in this organization help us as lobbying teams. While the League of Cities is the one that carried the bill and moved it forward, it was individuals like Marco and some of the people at the cities that really kind of let us know, hey, this would be great. It's not crucial, but it would be great to have. So kudos to the planners on this call that kind of gave us the idea.
So there were a couple bills that had to deal with vacation and abandoned easements, and AB 87 was one of them that ended up passing. Kelly, can you talk about that one?
Sure. AB 87 authorized cities and counties to establish more of a simplified process for the vacation of easements and abandonment of certain easements. This isn't any enabling legislation like the previous one. So cities have the opportunity or the option to do this. And really it just gives you another simplified process that you can take to your planning commissions and at a minimum your city councils to draft ordinances that would allow you to amend the vacation of easements ordinances. So it's a pretty simple bill. We didn't have a lot of opposition to this bill, and it kind of moved through the process quite quietly.
Another one that was a little bit interesting that similar had to do with process was AB 211 on tentative maps, and this in this sense we typically have tentative maps reviewed by other agencies and other entities. But now we have one that for NDOW. Calli, can you talk about how Division of Wildlife is now a part of the tentative map process?
Yeah, absolutely. So AB 211, just similar to the way in which jurisdictions will need to send tentative maps over to like NDEP or Board of Health in certain instances, we're required to send tentative maps for review to the Department of Wildlife. there was a lot of conversation about this bill originally, about the procedure in which the initial bill kind of came out. It provided a much longer time frame for NDOW to review tentative maps compared to others, which raised some procedural concerns about how to manage that process, knowing that those timeframes and deadlines for you guys as those projects are being reviewed and moving through the process at the local government level are tight, and there's a lot of very specific requirements to meet. So we worked on addressing that issue and ensuring that they were just a part of the process that was already kind of built in for those other agencies. There's an exception in the bill where this requirement doesn't exist for a governing body that has adopted a habitat conservation plan that's been approved by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Division. So I believe that that's most jurisdictions in Clark County. I don't know if it's I don't know exactly how that works, but I do know there wasn't much concern from the southern end of the state. It also allows NDOW to set a fee for reviewing these maps. So just something else to watch out for, that they will establish a fee through their regulatory process for that. The bill does have a cap on what that fee can be. And that was placed in there because there was conversation around the impact to affordable housing and housing costs throughout the state. So wanting to make sure that that was a part of the conversation as well. Lastly, the bill has an exemption for tentative maps for subdivisions for infill development. So those do not have to go to NDOW as well. So that bill took multiple forms over the course, but at the end of the day, NDOW will be reviewing tentative maps kind of throughout the state and sending their feedback back to governing bodies to incorporate into that review process.
So it seems like we can't have a legislative session without at least a few bills on cannabis and cannabis use, cannabis consumption. We had AB 326 on cannabis products at special events. We had AB 341 on cannabis consumption lounges, and then SB 168 on curbside pickup of cannabis. Calli, can you talk about maybe first the cannabis products at the special events, and then what some of the backstory is on that?
I think this is these three bills and some other bills that didn't go through all the way. These were bills that were kind of what I'll call cleanup language from the previous session. As the ballot question passed on the use of marijuana, there were a lot of questions up in the air in the 19th session about how, when, where you could utilize this. In 2019, they really focused on the taxing structure and how local governments might get a piece of that taxing structure. But they left out a lot of the use and events. The city of Las Vegas famously tried to pass our own ordinance when it came to lounges. And that's when they decided to implement the Cannabis Control Board and kind of have those conversations. And so these bills really came from a lot of those conversations in the 19th session. I'll let Calli, do you want to go through some of the?
Yeah, details? Absolutely. So AB 326 was the bill that was originally introduced that would have allowed special events and consumption of cannabis at those special events. This bill did not pass the session. It failed to get through, but a key component of it was actually included in AB 341 kind of in the last 48 hours of session. Always
those are my favorite bills. Calli got a crash course.
Yes. So there's a component in AB 341 that actually allows for the Cannabis Compliance Board to adopt regulations that allow for public consumption. So it's pretty broad. It's not necessarily specific to special events, but the intent around it is for future conversations around special events. And there is language in there that allows local governments to provide, have more restrictive kind of rules around cannabis events if those ever kind of come to fruition through the CCB board. It was something we were working very closely on in those final hours to make sure that there was some local control and dialogue that was able to happen at the local level.
And I'll say that piece of language that Calli's speaking of, where the local governments have a bit of a say in how that process will go, was negotiated with 8 hours to go within the legislative session. And the just so you guys can understand kind of the process of how those negotiations work. Some of the lobbyists that were saying, oh, no, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We're just going to take a little bit of this language. We're going to put it in this bill because that bill's going. And then we'll work with you in the session. We're already talking to your business licensing folks. So we'll work with you to figure out that language. And it was key that the provisions from 326 that got into 341, it was key that we put that language in there because we wanted to make sure they knew, no, you have to go to the local governments first before you make a decision on what kind of roads, streets, public spaces, parks, whatever it might be, where this consumption is going to take place.
So that's kind of, there was one big piece, there was a large kerfuffle at the end of the session as we worked on this bill, but really the majority of this 50-page bill is really setting up the premise to allow for cannabis consumption lounges. It was one of probably the major policy topics discussed during the session, and really meant to solve the problem of that there's nowhere for individuals, particularly tourists, to consume cannabis because they don't have a private home to be in. So the bill sets up, there's two types of cannabis establishments. One is attached or immediately adjacent to, and those are going to be the ones that are attached to existing retail establishments that we see in our communities today. The other one is an independent consumption lounge, which, as kind of the name says, it's not connected to another one. And half of the bill kind of states out initially there can be only 20 independent ones, and half of those are reserved to what they're calling social equity applicants. And they can only, both these types of establishments can only sell single use and ready to use products. So there's a lot more work that has to go into kind of understanding what these establishments can and cannot do. The bill started that process, but really the nitty-gritty details will be determined by the Cannabis Compliance Board through their regulatory process, which is happening right now. Our conversations have indicated that they're shooting to get these done by early 2022. So 6 months from now is kind of where they're looking to have these built out. Again, kind of language in this bill says you must comply with all local ordinances. So there's kind of a lot to unpack, but I really think kind of the regulatory process is going to be really key to understanding the impacts to our to local communities and where local governments may go from there. I think the other one was curbside pickup, which was SB 168. And this allows, it really kind of was driven by the COVID requirements and the allowance to provide curbside pickup for these establishments during COVID. This kind of says, okay, we're going to continue that, and it allows for curbside pickup once CCB adopts those regulations in an ongoing non-pandemic sort of way. It does allow local governments to prohibit curbside pickup based on characteristics of locations or other considerations. So local governments may want to consider how that kind of plays out in the planning world and impacts to local communities.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, for those of us who recently adopted a master plan, we were acutely aware of the need for housing of a lot of different types, whether it's missing middle housing, and then some new concepts. We know in just outside of downtown Reno, there's some tiny homes, and SB 150 talked about tiny homes. Calli, can you talk a little bit about that bill and what it was trying to do?
This is Calli's favorite bill of all the bills.
We had a lot of conversations around this bill, and there's a lot of stakeholders involved, and it really kind of brought up some questions around purview of local government in relation to zoning mandates and where where is kind of that line of where local decisions should be made versus mandates at the state, and this bill kind of really garnered that. Ultimately, the bill was revised to provide more flexibility for local governments, but there's still mandates in it. There's different requirements depending on the size of the city or county for those that are larger. You ultimately have to designate zoning districts where tiny houses are allowed for ADUs, for single family residential units, and located in a tiny house park. So for larger jurisdictions, you have to allow all three. For smaller jurisdictions, you have to allow at least one of the three. Near the end of session, there was also an amendment that was added to this bill. It says when you're considering this ordinance, you have to consider whether the locations will have disproportionately high or adverse human health and environmental effects on minority and low income populations. So it's an additional requirement to consider as jurisdictions are going to be adopting these ordinances in the next few years. The bill doesn't go into effect until January of 2024. So there's some time built into this bill to kind of be into compliance. But a lot of conversations around it. You know, we know that these topics can be very controversial depending on locations and the requirements. So trying to build in as much flexibility as we could, but this bill did garner the support to move forward in its form.
I would just echo, this is one of those examples where the virtual session was difficult for people like local jurisdictions. The large cities, Reno, Sparks, Las Vegas, and Henderson are part of what we call the Urban Consortium. We group together, we find like-minded bills that we can all agree on, and we work together to make sure that legislators understand that the largest cities are trying to talk about issues that impact large cities. We were in opposition to this bill throughout the session. We met with the sponsor multiple times as 4 large cities to talk about how it would impact local governments, and the provisions that the smaller cities were allowed where they can only implement one of those 3 options was actually what we were trying to negotiate. Okay, we're not going to oppose this bill on its face just to oppose it. We'll work with you. We'll meet you halfway. Ask us to implement one of the 3 provisions. And at the end of the day, you know, this legislator stuck to her guns and what she wanted to do on tiny homes, and large cities kind of lost out on that a little bit. And so it's just one example of how the virtual session kind of impacted lobbying efforts.
At a much larger scale, though, you know, we have different jurisdictions do different planned unit developments in different ways, or they call them different things. And we did have a bill that was that went through SB 138. You talk about how that revised the planned unit development process.
So this bill, this bill was driven by the city of Henderson and working in collaboration with the lawmakers to kind of solve some problems that they had seen locally down there. And really, it's another enabling legislation that allows local jurisdictions to create ordinances that would allow minor modifications of PUDs. It kind of sets up requirements when you cannot use this type of ordinance within the process. But again, you know, we're always seeking to kind of provide additional opportunities or flexibilities within the law to make your, to give the opportunities within your field more flexibility. So
as far as amenities go, we have a lot of, there's been a lot of emphasis on, you know, reusing land and, you know, for different purposes, especially in blighted or in infill areas. There was a push several years ago to incorporate urban agriculture into master plans. That's something that we did with the 2050 master plan, and I know that's been something that, you know, I think a lot of people agree on. SB 297 took that and expanded upon it on the concept of community gardens and urban agriculture a little bit. Can you talk, Kelly, can you talk a little bit about SB 297?
Like you said, SB 297 was an urban agriculture bill. It required that we provide community gardens within urban areas. Another great example of a legislator pet project, I'll say. that just, she wanted to see things done, just like the tiny homes project. A lot of us tried to kind of discuss with this legislator that many of us are already doing this. Many of us already have community garden projects in our community services programs. But we were able to kind of amend this bill as local government lobbyists to make it a little bit more palatable for local jurisdictions. So in the original form, this bill would have forced us to go out across our jurisdictions and survey and map out all available parcels that we could have these community gardens in, which would have confused the process a little bit. We were able to take that provision out and work with her to kind of change how we would look at these parcels and how we would allow individuals to come out and identify a parcel. This also gives an abatement, a tax abatement on some of these parcels for a short amount of time to kind of incentivize people to come out and build community gardens. Originally, there was not clarifying language on how that abatement process would happen. So if an applicant went to the county, because they're the ones that do the abatements, if an individual went to the county and said, hey, I saw this parcel of land next to Circa Las Vegas and I want to build a community garden, there wasn't clarifying language on whether or not the county could just say, check, yes, here's your abatement, go build this community garden, without first checking with our planning departments to say, yes, that's what we want to happen next to Circa is a community garden in the middle of downtown Las Vegas. So local government lobbyists were able to work and amend that bill to say that first the application has to come through the local jurisdiction planning departments or whatever departments sign off on that. And then in conjunction with the county, we'll let you know whether or not that parcel is eligible for a community garden space.
So on AB 333 had to do with a judicial review of planning decisions. And that's one that I don't know if it was on people's radar that much. Calli, can you talk about that one and just what it does?
Sure, absolutely. The first part of AB 333 is really kind of legal, procedural, and deadlines for when an applicant or an appellant is going to seek judicial relief following a final decision by a governing body related to a decision in NRS 278. But the core chunk is kind of the second half of it, and it's relating to water rights. And what it is discussing is essentially saying if a local governing body has certain retention and detention mitigation requirements on a project as a condition of approval, certain kind of adjudicating water rights in NRS 533 don't apply to the project. And because of those requirements by a local governing body related to controlling flooding concerns or stormwater management. So it's kind of a very technical bill in the world of water rights, but definitely an interesting one that we took part in a conversation, just knowing, trying to understand the implications. It's kind of outside, but ultimately what it does is say certain water right components do not apply if governing bodies have these regulations and conditions of approval on projects. And it only impacts locations outside of Clark County. So it's the rest of the state.
So one thing that I know affects all of us, whether you're in Tahoe, whether you're in the Reno area or in Southern Nevada, is short-term rentals. AB 363, Calli, it's that one passed, and I'm sure that's definitely worthy of some discussion.
This is my favorite bill. Calli's favorite bill was tiny homes. My favorite bill was AB 363. I'm sure everyone's aware. In its original form, it would put specific requirements, zoning requirements on short-term. Those requirements were a long list of different things, and I can't remember the exact, but room night rentals, how many rooms in a home, distance separation from gaming properties, just a list of things that we as local jurisdictions would have had to put in our ordinances. Originally, it affected the entire state. As this bill, so this was one of those bills that kind of got sucked up by the process as well. There weren't these thought out negotiations and conversations with the legislator and people that were impacted by the bill. I would say one of the problems with a virtual session is the drafting process. So this bill didn't get drafted till sometime in, I want to say, March. So no one ever saw the actual real language of this bill until we were well into the session. And then it was hit with a deadline. And so we had to hear the bill in its original form. And this is where the process, I think, is great. A lot of neighborhood organizations called in the North. We saw a lot of the Incline Village residents call in and say, no, we've already negotiated this. We've already talked about, we have a ban on short-term rentals, or we have this and that. And so after that first deadline, the amendment came in that took out Northern Nevada. You're welcome, Calli. Which meant that that bill no longer impacted the Northern entities. I will just tell you not off the record, it's very public. The legislator that brought this bill forward said she's coming for the North next session. So y'all should start working with that legislator now so that you can get the language you want in that bill. But towards the middle of session, this bill really became about Clark County and how Clark County is implementing short-term rentals. And I will say that the majority of the focus was on Clark County, the jurisdiction, because Clark County had a moratorium on short-term rentals. It became very apparent that the legislature wanted Clark County to take action, and the moratorium was not the action they wanted them to take. So this bill went through, gosh, 5, 6, 7 different variations, where City of Las Vegas, City of North Las Vegas, and City of Henderson really worked with the legislator to try to make sure that the majority of our ordinances that we already have in place were not impacted. So when you see originally, I think the bill said there was a 500 distance separation from short-term rental to short-term rental. City of Las Vegas had the largest distance at 660 feet. And so we were able to get that in there. That helped. North Las Vegas and Henderson had different distances that were under that 660. And we were allowed to be more stringent. 660 helped the City of Las Vegas not have to change our ordinance. The biggest change that we see is that the Resort Association basically ran the 2,500 ring around the property is what we call it, the distance separation from gaming establishments. There was clarifying language that had to be put in this bill in one of its iterations, because originally the language said 2,500 feet from gaming, that means Dottie's and local casinos and, tiny, is that gaming vessels that are in like a grocery store. If that were the case, then there would be no short-term rentals anywhere. So we were able to kind of get this language to a place where most local jurisdictions are only going to have to go back and switch the ordinances for the gaming property ring, and everything else pretty much stays intact. Clark County had to, so the effective date is not until July of next year. Clark County had to, by July of this year, which just passed, they had to put in place acknowledgement they were starting their process. So they're going to have to go through and do neighborhood meetings and community outreach to see what Clark County residents will want to see in a short-term rental ordinance in Clark County, which will probably be messy because I know the City of Las Vegas was. But that bill really impacted Clark at its fullest. We are hopeful that we can work with the legislator in the next session to talk about enforcement. And that was a big piece of what we argued with her was you can put all of these regulations on us. You can tell us that we need to put better regulations within our ordinances. We do not have the manpower and the staff to implement some of these establishments. And we're getting, hundreds of calls a day saying there's an illegal short-term rental on my neighborhood. So I would say again, as an organization, if you have ideas on how we can draft legislation that helps with the implementation and enforcement of some of these regulations, that's what we're going to be looking at in the next session, along with Calli spearheading the Northern Nevada short-term rental ordinances.
So we talked about a bill that was kind of specific to Southern Nevada and may eventually in Northern as well. we heard a lot this session from the governor and GOED about what eventually became Senate Concurrent Resolution 11 and innovation zones. Calli, can you talk to us about this bill, just the concept? I find it really intriguing. I mean, it's maybe even more so because my sister and brother-in-law are residents of Story County, and just the whole concept seems a little controversial.
I think that's a fair way to put it, Marco. I mean, we really first learned about Innovation Zone really through the media when they released stories and had a copy of a proposed BDR that kind of outlined what this concept, essentially allowing the creation of a new local government entity built around new technologies such as blockchain technology. It kind of laid out how that transition away from county authority for that entity would work in terms of when taxes would transfer, their role and how they would decide, and the makeup of a new governing body. But really from the session, that bill was never formally introduced. It was this conversation that existed as a part of the session, but never actually a bill that came forward and was formally introduced to say, here's kind of what an innovation zone concept is. So there was a lot of questions and concerns about such a major policy that was being introduced, but really we never saw the actual bill language besides kind of what was working behind the scenes as a proposal. But at the end of session, this bill really kind of transferred to a study to vet the idea of innovation zones and its impacts to economic development, housing, water supplies, other natural resources, revenue, impacts to local governments. And that interim study kicked off 2 weeks ago with that legislative committee meeting. And so they're planning on meeting monthly and having this conversation. Usually these interim studies are about, more than 6 months. This one is, the bill kind of dictates that they need to prepare a report and recommendations to the governor by the end of this year. So it's a very short time frame for this kind of conversation to occur. But the bill or the study kind of outlines their recommendations, whether it'll be no further action, whether they would recommend legislation on innovation zones that could either occur during a special session or during the next legislative session. So something that we're watching closely, definitely a big policy conversation happening across the state and trying to understand those impacts. I know that the legislators involved in that committee are really trying to kind of get into the nitty gritty and understanding what this concept could do and its impacts. So
we recently had the first ever declaration of a shortage for the Colorado River in the Colorado River Basin, and all the basin states are feeling the effects of the drought that's been going on for the last 20 years. And one bill that's received a lot of national attention on top of the cuts in allocation that we're all receiving is AB 356, which cuts non-functional turf. Kelly, can you talk about that bill and what that will end up doing?
Sure. So AB 356 basically asks the Southern Nevada area to remove non-functional turf by 2026, I believe, is the deadline for that. This is one of those fascinating bills to me that, like, it's a small bill. It wasn't, the original bill had nothing to do with this. The language was amended into a bill that pretty much was what we understand to be kind of dead on arrival. And so they utilized this shell to put the language in 356. There was controversy or clarification needed on what non-functional turf was. Lots of entities thought that meant parks, soccer facilities, stuff like that. So it was clarified in hearings that it really is, those medians that have grass on it that no one ever stands on, and the amount of water that could be saved if we just took those patches of grass out. It was widely supported. Again, one of those bills that really is easy to get through the session. Probably was, besides short-term rentals, and probably innovation zones, got the most media attention in the session, which is interesting. But it basically just incentivizes local governments to take those out of public right away.
So for both of you, what were some of the bills or issues that came up during the session that were maybe unexpected and didn't know that they were going to happen at all?
Well, I'll start. I think this, again, I can't remember the bill number. Calli, can you remember the Star Bonds bill number?
376, maybe?
There was a bill, had nothing to do with Southern Nevada, had nothing to, we were fine with the bill. In the last few days of session, put in it that would get rid of Star Bonds. For those that are in Southern Nevada, some of those bonds were used for the Area 15 project. And incentivizing developers to build in that industrial area. The legislature was afraid that Southern Nevada was going to try to use these Star Bonds to build what was being at the time rumored as the Oakland A's stadium. And it was very, very much on the legislators' mind that they did not want to use public dollars like they did in the Allegiant project. They did not want to build another stadium with public dollars. And so we were able to save that piece for cultural centers, things like the Smith Center, things like Symphony Park in that area, things like the Area 15 project that is out here in Southern Nevada. They took it, I believe they took it out of Northern Nevada so that Southern Nevada was the only area that could continue to use these. I know that Calli tried to stay clear of it because Star Bonds were used on the baseball stadium out there in Reno. And there was some controversy there, and it was run by a Northern Nevada legislator, so she was concerned about that. But that was one of those surprise bills that, again, that language was nowhere, was never a conversation. No one was talking about it. And then 3 days before session, this amendment comes in, and we had to have a conference committee. Unlike any other, conference committees are usually when you have disagreement on a bill, they go into conference committee. It's a quick, in a closet or in a tiny room, the three legislators, they meet, they move their distances, they figure out, what they're going to negotiate, and they move the bill forward. I actually ended up having to testify pretty lengthy on why the city of Las Vegas still wanted to use Star Bonds, which is unheard of in a conference committee setting. So definitely a surprise for me. I thought I was pretty much done with the session at that point.
Surprise. Yeah, and ultimately, Calli, I don't know if you mentioned this, that bill was vetoed by the governor. It was one of the 4 vetoes that he used coming out of the session. So that tool remains in place for local governments throughout the state. I think for me, wasn't necessarily a bill that was unexpected. This was my first session for the City of Reno. And I definitely was anticipating many conversations around police reform, given the very important conversations that are happening in our country. What I didn't anticipate was kind of the breadth of changes to the entire criminal justice system. Our local courts will be making some very significant operational changes with some of the bills that were passed this session in relation to criminal justice reform. Traffic citations, many that were formerly misdemeanors, they will be moving to civil infractions. That is a big, not necessarily policy concern. I think we all knew that the policy that was being tried to solve, but it's a very heavy lift operationally to kind of update the entire system and how we all of our courts operate to make that happen. There's requirements around bail hearings, kind of not allowing an ability to spend a driver's license in certain cases, and municipal courts can hold jury trials for certain domestic violence cases. So again, not necessarily policy issues that we had concerns with, but when you kind of look at the big package of criminal justice, there is going to be a pretty significant impact, particularly on our courts coming out of the legislative session.
There were a number of bills on housing that failed to pass out of committee. And given what's going on in the housing market in both Reno and Las Vegas, why didn't more housing policy bills get through?
Do you want to go?
Calli and I talked about this yesterday a lot. And I really, if I'm being really honest, a lot of it came down to politics. Just those housing bills, you know, in a normal session, and maybe this is part of the impact that COVID had on this legislative session. In a normal session, you meet with individuals that are going to be impacted by a bill, right? So in the housing bills, great community organizations trying to help solve the housing crisis. Those collaborative conversations with realtors and home builders and to an extent to local jurisdictions, those conversations didn't happen, and they couldn't naturally happen in the legislative process like we normally do at a bar or at a restaurant or out in the, you know, in front of the legislative building. Those conversations couldn't happen. And so I think it was a lot of impact on just the process. Homelessness never came up. That was a huge topic in 2019. There were no bills on homelessness coming out of this session. So I really think it was just priorities kind of overtook what they were going to pass.
Yeah. So as we wrap up here, please, if anybody has any questions, we'll open it up for a couple questions here. Please put those in the chat box. So one last one from me. Looking ahead to this interim and to the 2023 session, what should Nevada residents and Nevada planners expect or look forward to?
Sure, I know there's probably some questions, so I'll be real quick. This interim, we know we're gonna be having a special session on redistricting. That data, according to the Census Bureau, won't be final till September. So we're looking to kind of understand when that special session at the state level will occur. We're hearing that session possibly could also include some items related to how they're going to spend their rescue plan dollars. So yet to be determined on that aspect.
I think the other piece as planners that you all should be aware of is a bill passed this session, and I can't remember the bill number, that instead of having the interim committees where they take legislators and put them on new committees for the interim, they passed a bill that would take all of the legislative policy committees and put them into the interim process. And so these policy committees will now be having conversations. They get 10 to 15, depending on the committee. They get 10 BDRs, which they've never gotten before. And so we think we will see a lot of policy come out of those interim committees that wouldn't normally happen in an interim process. So I would be tuned into that because likely a lot of those conversations will impact you.
Thank you. So I'll pick a few that are in our chat queue here. One was on our other local jurisdictions contemplating prohibiting cannabis lounges, and there was a note here that Carson City has voted to prohibit lounges, that they are allowing curbside. I think the Board of Supervisors went through with that, and then a text amendment going to the CCPC tomorrow. Any other jurisdictions prohibiting cannabis?
I have not seen any other jurisdiction take formal action to do so. I mean, whether or not those kind of conversations are happening internally and something will occur in the future, I have not heard of any of those conversations, but it's possible.
Okay. Can Clark County entities, including the county itself, contract to regulate or enforce short-term rentals countywide?
I mean, I think that's a conversation that the entities could have. I know that the big argument that Clark County was using during their fight on it 363 was that they don't have staff at all allocated to enforcement. City of Las Vegas, I believe, has 1 or 2 enforcement people within our department. So I think that, I mean, yes, that we could, but we would need to work to staff the county up because their argument was that they don't have anyone right now enforcing it.
One of my favorite ones, I like talking about this one, is home rule for cities coming up at all as an issue that's emerging, or is even though we've had the functional home rule bill passed before for counties and general law and chartered cities, any other discussion on that, you know, especially considering how state, you know, the state at the legislative level likes to operate, and, you know, we're fairly restricted being Dillon's rule.
I was a part of the team that worked on that 2015 home rule bill. We had 4 different bills throughout that session to try to get that passed, and we ended up getting an emergency measure 24 hours before the session ended that implemented that functional home rule. I don't think we will ever, just coming from the Chamber of Commerce world and the business community world, I don't think we'll ever get fiscal home rule. I think we can try and chip away at functional home rule, but an actual home rule bill, to my opinion, is dead on arrival. It's targeted the minute that it's drafted.
Can you clarify gaming for Star? Is there any reference to restricted or non-restricted gaming in that?
I think it's for the short-term rentals. It's
short-term rentals. Yeah.
It's for Kelly, the requirement in the short-term rentals bill, it was for non-restricted gaming, right? Ultimately was the clarification that was added in the bill.
Yeah, originally it wasn't clarified, and the last version of the bill had non-restrictive in there.
What was the status of the bill regulating the classic vehicles, the loophole bill related to air quality?
That bill did end up making it through the session. So it went through some iterations, particularly at the end in terms of kind of the revenue and fees that go along with it, to kind of give that authority at the county level, because it would have required a 2/3 vote at the state level. And so that change helped the bill get through the session.
What do you think the best way for citizens or residents are to participate in the session? The exclusion of open meeting law makes it difficult for individuals to obtain info and to participate, especially as things are coming so fast, and you often don't have a lot of time to react, especially if it's like the morning of or hours before.
I think the one good thing that this session provided, while it was very difficult for paid lobbyists to do our jobs, I think we'll see some version of this virtual process stay with the legislative process. They had a lot of constituents participate that normally would have had to go to Grant Sawyer or come all the way to Carson City to participate. So I think that we will see more options for constituents to participate in a virtual world. Calli, anything else?
No, I was going to say the same thing. I actually think, one of the benefits of this, while our job was harder and talking to each other and kind of negotiating amendments, really we saw constituents who would never have been able to, because they could call in, they could participate in a Zoom, participate in these hearings and bills. So yeah, it is a pretty difficult process to kind of be involved in, but I think that we've heard from some of the legislators that was really a benefit, and looking to see how that will continue.
Well, and I think that as lobbyists, boohoo to us, but that was a frustration of ours, because committee meetings were, okay, we're going to take 20 minutes of support and 20 minutes of opposed, and we had to dial in as well. And so as we think of ourselves as the subject matter experts and not just a constituent kind of complaining about one way or the other, we weren't able to get in the queue to testify on how these impacts would happen to local jurisdictions. And so constituents were able to participate, but it meant lobbyists couldn't.
We're at the top of the hour here. Again, on behalf of the APA Nevada chapter, thank you, Calli and Kelly, both of you, for the informative session. We really appreciate your insight and your expertise and what you do for your respective cities. It helps make the planning profession better, and we're glad that you were able to share what happened this session. Thanks again.